On Mother's Day, the story of Ruth kind of stuck in my head. I don't know if this is a story that you're familiar with, but it's a story that was told, and it's put in kind of the middle of the history of God's people, from Moses on forward. It probably was written down a lot later than some of those, but this is the time when it's said. And to explain what's going on, there's some things that the people who read and wrote the story understood that we kind of need to understand if you really want to see what's going on here. So it starts out with Elimelech. I have practiced that, don't worry. Elimelech and Naomi, this man and this woman, who are Hebrews, they're Israelites, and they go off to Moab to live. Now that's a problem because the Israelites came to the land that God had given them, right? And God said, this is the land that I'm giving you, and you stay here, and I'll bless you. He didn't say, when things get tough, go leave and go live somewhere else. So they're already starting to get a little off track. And then when they go into Moab, their sons marry Moabite women. This was seen as a really bad thing. One thing I've noticed even today, probably 90%, when couples marry for different churches, and this is not a reflection on it, 90% of the time, the family usually ends up in the women's church. Traditionally, for whatever reason, you can have a whole conversation about this, but on Mother's Day it's worth mentioning, women tend to carry those religious traditions. And so when a woman and a man come together, it's usually the woman who ends up passing on her traditions or teaching or whatever. And that was true back then even. And so the reason there's all these things about don't marry foreign women. And the real issue, the reason it was such a concern is because more often than not, it meant that the kids would end up being raised worshiping foreign gods, idols. The Moabites had a whole set of idols they worshiped. And when Israelite men married Moabite women, just like today, they usually end up following along in the religion of their mother. Now today, going to one church or another doesn't really matter. You know, that's one of our basic things. But back then, it wasn't a question of one church or another. It was a question of God or not God, which is a much bigger deal. So this family that we have is already pretty unorthodox. They've already gone off track. Genesis doesn't say anything about who is worshiping who, what gods they follow or anything. And then when the sons die, Naomi decides to go back to her country. And Ruth decides to follow her, which is not the way it's done. That's why Naomi said, you got to go back. And out of this whole statement that Ruth says, the thing that really stands out is that one at the very end, your God will be my God. You notice it goes together. That's kind of what I was saying. The people, the land, the family, the God, they're all linked together in the way people thought back then. So if you're a Moabite, you stuck with the Moabite gods. If you're an Israelite, you went with the Israelite God. Ruth says, I'm switching over. I'm signing up with your people for real and your God for real. This was not the way things normally happened. This is not the way things normally went. But Ruth goes back. And what happens to Ruth when she goes back is that she marries an Israelite guy. They have children. The children have children. One of her grandsons was a guy named Jesse. Jesse had a son you might have heard of. His name was David. David, many generations down the line, had a descendant who also came from a kind of unorthodox family, a guy named Jesus. And so this story of Ruth is part of the story of Jesus. It's part of our story. And it highlights this very unorthodox and not normal way that Jesus' family came together. Ruth is one of the few women who's mentioned specifically in the ancestors of Jesus. They mention the men usually, but they mention Ruth, partly because she was famous. And I also think partly because it's a reminder that, well, Jesus had this kind of strange start. So did some other important people in our history. It's a reminder that families, and then Mother's Day mothers, can come in a lot of different forms.